May 1945. A 16th-century castle stands on a high Bavarian hill. The morning air is cold and still. American guards stand at the iron gates. They smoke, they watch the valley. The war in Europe is over. The stone walls of the castle house, the headquarters of the United States Third Army. A man walks up the steep road. He wears a tailored pre-war suit and polished leather shoes. A gold watch chain hangs from his vest. He stops in front of the young soldiers. He does not ask for food. He does not ask for medicine. He demands the return of his home. He says his family has owned this dirt since the year 1547. He expects the Americans to pack their bags. He expects his noble life to resume. He does not know that Patton is watching from the balcony. He does not know his castle is about to become a barn. This is the story of the German baron who demanded his castle back, and the general who decided it was better suited for horses. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities in the wreckage of a fallen empire. We reveal the moments where the past collided with the future. Corporal Elias Thorne was 24 years old. He came from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He served with the 5th Infantry Division. Before the war, he worked his father's cornfields. He enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor. His older brother had died in the hedgerows of St. Lo. Elias still carried a jagged half of his brother's dog tag in his left pocket. He rubbed the metal when the nights got cold. He had marched through the freezing slush of the Ardennes and the ruins of Frankfurt. His boots were worn thin. His eyes were heavy with the weight of 3 years of death. He wanted to go home to the Iowa soil. He stood at the heavy iron gates of the Adelsburg Castle on that May morning. He held his M1 Garand across his chest. He was the first person the Baron spoke to. He was the man who had to listen to a ghost talk about property. Baron Maximilian von Adelsburg was 52. He was a Prussian-Bavarian aristocrat. He had never known a day of hunger. His family had owned the castle on the hill since 1547. He wore a gray suit made of fine English wool. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. A gold pocket watch ticked in his vest. He stood with the straight back of a man who believed the earth was made for his feet. He looked at the American soldiers like they were stray dogs in his garden. He believed his name gave him a right that no treaty could break. He once told his wife that blood was the only currency that mattered in Europe. He thought the Americans were just temporary guests in a world they did not understand. To him, the war was a loud interruption. He believed the old ways would return as soon as the smoke cleared. He expected his silver to be polished. He expected his bed to be made. He stood before the gate and spoke with the cold tone of a master addressing a servant. May 1945 was a month of silence and scavenging. The German army had broken into pieces. The government in Berlin was a pile of charred bricks. Across the Bavarian countryside, the landscape was a mess of white flags and abandoned Tiger tanks. The Third Army moved into the vacuum. They needed roofs. They needed desks. They needed places to sleep. The American military took over hotels and schoolhouses. They took over the stone fortresses of the old elite. Everything was in flux. Local laws were gone. The only law was the word of the local commander. In many towns, the occupation was soft. Some American colonels liked the feel of velvet curtains. They liked the taste of hidden wine cellars. They often let the local nobility stay in their side wings. They let them keep their titles. They treated the war like a misunderstanding between gentlemen. They let the arrogance of the old order survive in the corners of their own headquarters. They ignored the fact that these same families had funded the machine that destroyed Europe. General George S. Patton did not like soft deals. He did not care about family trees. To him, a defeated enemy was an enemy. He saw the way the German upper class tried to pivot. They tried to act like victims of a regime they had once toasted with champagne. They thought their history protected them from the consequences of the present. They expected the Americans to be impressed by their oil paintings and their ancestors. The hills around the valley were green with spring. The smell of pine needles and wet earth hung in the air. The Baron stood on the gravel path and looked at the young corporal from Iowa. Captain Jack Miller was 29 years old. He came from Columbus, Ohio. He led a company in the 10th Armored Division. Back home, he worked in a hardware store selling nails and lumber. He had lost 3 tanks and 12 men in the push across the Rhine. He walked down the stone steps to the castle gate. He saw the Baron standing there. "Good morning," Miller said. "It is nearly noon," the Baron answered. Miller looked at the gold watch chain. "We need you to step back from the perimeter," he said. "I am not a visitor," the Baron said. "I am the owner." "The castle is under military requisition," Miller said. "It is our headquarters." "That is a temporary inconvenience," the Baron said. "My family has been here since 1547. "The war changed things, Baron," Miller said. "The war changed the borders." The Baron said, "It did not change the blood in my veins." "You need to return to the village," Miller said. "You are blocking the supply road. I will not live in a rented room while American peasants sleep in my bed," the Baron said. Miller tightened his grip on his clipboard. "These men are soldiers, not peasants." "They are boys from the dirt," the Baron said. "They walk on my rugs with muddy boots. They smoke in the gallery. It is an insult to the natural order of the world." Miller looked at the Baron's polished shoes. "There is no old order left for you today." "There is always an order," the Baron said. "Your country is a child. My name is carved into the stones of this valley. You will move your trucks. You will move your desks." "I have my orders from the division," Miller said. "Your orders are for common people." The Baron said, "I am Baron Maximilian von Adelsberg. I do not take directions from men who used to sell hammers in Ohio." Miller felt the heat in his neck. He looked at the castle. He looked at the man in the fine wool suit. "You are not going to leave, are you?" Miller asked. "I am staying until my keys are returned," the Baron said. "I demand my home. I demand the respect my title carries." Miller turned to a sergeant. "Stay here. Do not let him pass the arch." "Where are you going?" the Baron asked. "I am going to see the general," Miller said. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep rattled up the gravel drive. Dust kicked up against the Baron's polished shoes. The general stepped out. He wore a pressed uniform with 4 silver stars on his helmet. 2 ivory-handled revolvers hung at his hips. He did not look at the castle. He looked at the man. Everyone at the gate stood still. Patton stopped a few feet from the Baron. He pulled a silver case from his pocket and selected a cigar. "You are the owner of this property?" Patton asked. "I am," the Baron said. "My family has held these stones since 1547, and you want the United States Army to leave?" "Immediately," the Baron replied. "This is a private residence. It is not a barracks for commoners." "You feel your history makes this building special?" "It is sacred to my bloodline," the Baron said. "And you find our presence here an insult to your rank?" "I find it a violation of everything Europe stands for," the Baron said. Patton looked at the Baron's gold watch. He looked at the polished shoes. "You talk about 400 years of ownership. You talk about your blood. You think that because your ancestors sat in this hall, the world owes you a debt. You think the walls of this castle protect you from the war you helped start. The war was a political failure," the Baron said. "The war was a slaughter. Your people tore up the maps of the world. You broke every law of man. Now you come to me with a deed from the 16th century and expect me to care about your comfort." Patton pointed to Corporal Thorne at the gate. "That boy is from Iowa. He has slept in holes for a year. He has eaten cold rations in the rain. He has watched his friends die in the dirt. So you could be free of the monster your kind created. His boots are muddy because he walked through fire to get here." "He is a soldier," the Baron said. "It is his job. His job was to win. He won, you lost. In the New World, a man is judged by what he does, not by who his father was. Your title is a ghost. Your history is a pile of rubble. You want this castle back because you think it makes you better than the men who defeated you." "I have a right to my heritage," the Baron said. "You have a right to a choice. You can leave now and find a room in the village. Or you can stay and watch what I do with your heritage. If you stay, you will see exactly how much your noble history is worth to a modern army." Patton did not wait for an answer. He turned to Captain Miller. "Clear the furniture out of the great hall," he said. "Bring in the horses." Within 2 hours, work crews from the 5th Infantry arrived with hammers and saws. They did not move the furniture with care. They tossed velvet chairs out of the second-story windows. They dragged heavy oak tables across the polished marble floors. The sound of wood splintering filled the valley. The Baron watched from the gravel drive. He saw his ancestors' portraits stacked like firewood in the mud. Soldiers brought in truckloads of straw. They spread it over the intricate rugs. They built wooden stalls in the grand ballroom. 75 horses from the cavalry units were led through the front doors. Their iron shoes clicked on the stone where dukes once danced. The smell of fresh manure and wet hay replaced the scent of old wax and perfume. A sergeant climbed a ladder above the main entrance. He took a crowbar to the stone Adelsberg family crest. The shield cracked and fell into the dirt. In its place, the sergeant nailed a single, rusted horseshoe. Patton stood by his jeep and watched the first horse enter the hall. He looked at the Baron. The old world was gone. The castle was a barn. Elias Thorne went back to Cedar Rapids in the spring of 1946. He took over the family farm and married a girl from the next county over. He lived a quiet life and never talked much about the war. Every Sunday when he cleaned the stables for his own workhorses, he would think about that stone castle in Bavaria. He died in 1998 at the age of 78, surrounded by cornfields and grandchildren. He always told his sons that a man's worth was found in the calluses on his hands, not the letters in his name. Baron Maximilian von Adelsberg never set foot in the castle again. He lived out his remaining years in a cramped three-room apartment in the village, staring up at the hill every morning. He spent a decade writing letters to the occupation government and later the West German authorities, demanding compensation for the desecration of his ancestral home. No one answered his pleas. The land reforms of the 1950s stripped him of the last of his estate. He died in 1962, a bitter man who still wore his pre-war suits even as the wool turned to rags. He was buried in a small plot at the edge of the village, far from the vaulted stone crypts of his fathers. General Patton kept a single photograph of the horses in the Great Hall in his private files. He mentioned the incident once in a letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote that the Baron was a man who tried to live in a house that had already burned down. He noted that the horses seemed much more comfortable in the ballroom than the nobility ever had. Some historians argue that Patton's decision was an act of unnecessary cultural vandalism. They suggest that the defacement of the castle and the destruction of family heirlooms served no military purpose and only worked to humiliate a defeated civilian. Others argue that the move was a necessary psychological blow against the remnants of a dangerous social order. They believe it sent a definitive message that the era of inherited privilege was over and that the new world would not respect the old ghosts of aristocracy. What is certain is that the image of horses in the Great Hall became a durable symbol of the occupation. It marked the moment the weight of the past was finally crushed by the reality of the present. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have turned the castle into a stable, or would you have let the Baron keep a small corner of his ancestral home? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.